Hello and welcome back to another customization video. Today we'll be turning this Peterstone Pelouse into a dramatic unicorn. This will be a fun model to work with because she is quite big. The first thing to do is to Photoshop a picture into the pose I want to make. This helps me visualize what I want to do, as well as a guideline to mark where I will be cutting. I also recommend photopea as a free alternative. On some parts of the model I'll be drawing on the skeleton to visualize the anatomy. So with that all done, it's time for cutting. As always when using the Dremel, I'm wearing a respirator, eye protection, gloves, and long sleeves. The first thing to do is cut these ears off with my thin cutting disc. I make sure to do this while the head is still attached so it's a little bit easier. I will be saving and reattaching these ears later, so I'm careful not to cut too much off. Once they're off, I can shave down the forelock and stumps with a sanding drum. This is a good time to mention I also have a fan pointed at the model to blow any smoke away. The legs will be a little bit harder to cut since they are solid plastic. Luckily, this thin cutting disc also helps with sanding down areas. At this point I remembered I should start out and work in while there's still strength in the leg. And with all the cuts made, let's move some limbs. I heat up the plastic with my embossing gun, making sure not to hold it in one spot for too long so it won't bubble. Once it's hot enough, I can slowly pull the leg where I want it to be. I start at the top and work down so I know exactly where it will end up. You can also see I have my references on the wall so I can keep looking at them. Once it's where I like it, I dunk it into my ice water bath to freeze it into place. Sometimes I swirl it around in there to really make sure it's hardened. Before I reattach the head, let's get those ears back on. Luckily I can use the original ones. I'll just be swapping them so they are pointed backwards. Very carefully I drill into them with a bit a little bit bigger than my sturdy wire. Then I drill in where they will go into the head. To make sure you get the spot right, I would hold the ears up and mark where their hole is onto the head. While I'm at it, I also do the tail hole. Since she currently has no neck, I can put a loop in the wire and pull it through so it will be extra sturdy. For the ears, I made the wire one piece since the head isn't attached yet. Those ears won't be going anywhere either. I mix up my 2-part glue and glue all my wires in, including what will be the top of her neck. After the glue had dried overnight, I can test the ears. I had to make a few adjustments with my pliers, but then I can glue on those as well. Next, I can attach all that to the body. Before doing this, I made sure to sand inside the body, to roughen it up a bit so it will hold better. This Peterstone plastic is especially slick. I hold the wire where I want it to be and add some hot glue to temporarily hold it in place while the strong glue dries. This takes a few tries sometimes, and I still support the head with other random things laying around. Once that dries, I can remove the hot glue and add extra strength with my 2-part epoxy. I also add the bottom part of the neck. I go through it kind of fast here, but it does take a while to bend the wire into the exact pose. I had to hold it up to my computer screen with the reference photos to get it right. Once that had all hardened, I can fill in the neck. I start with a base of masking tape. I give it some strength and bulk with hot glue. Before I get too far though, I make sure to wrap the main armature around the neck wire. I'm just using a thin floral wire. Okay, I can't put it off any longer. Time to start making a base. This will make it easier to sculpt everything if she can stand. I start with this pine block scrap I found laying around. I drew a rough template and used my Dremel with a sanding drum to wear it down to this point. I'll be using this wire as a starting point for where the horse will stand. I mark where I want it to be and drill the holes. I used some E6000 to glue it into place. I made sure to have my respirator on so I wouldn't breathe any of it in. I also make sure to use a wire to move any excess since you shouldn't touch it. I had some masking tape to fill it in. For a while I did use this base as a dumping ground for leftover epoxy from other projects, so I could build up the strength. I also added any leftover hard pieces that I had saved over the years. So yay, nothing going to waste! Now for the scary part, actually getting her on there. First I mark where I want the holes to be after lining up the hooves. I have to bend this whole part up to fit my drill in. For this main support, I'm using a metal rod from the hardware store. For now, it will go all the way into the bottom of the base, but the hope is, once the base is stronger, I can cut the extra away. That's the plan anyway. But at least for the sculpting phase, I won't have to worry about being gentle with it. I add some wire to keep it in place. Okay, now to drill the holes into the hooves. I hold her up to my base and draw a line so I can get the right angle. I also hold the drill bit next to it and put tape where I need to stop. Then I can test it on the support, and miraculously I got it first try. I thought I was for sure going to have to refill it with epoxy and redo it at least once. So now we can move on to the back hoof. I marked where the hoof will touch the base, while the other hoof is in the support, so it will line up. I had to get help holding the rod while I used my giant cutters. I have to make this little notch first so the drill doesn't just slide off. This one was tricky, but I made sure to go slow and take my time and make sure it was lining up right. And yay, success! She sits up there pretty sturdily. I go in and add some strength and build it up a little bit more. Here you can see my pile of leftover epoxy from years of projects. Clearly I haven't figured out the right amounts to mix yet, but luckily I can use them here to fill space. I just stick them into the fresh epoxy and they hold together great. Now that we have somewhat of a base started, I can get back to the main event. Actually the neck, but close enough. I start bulking it up with hot glue and aluminum foil. I make sure to look at pictures of real horses as well as anatomy drawings for this, since some parts need to be thicker depending on the muscles. I still could have added more honestly, but I was worried it would be too thick. Before I add the epoxy to the neck, I add some to the legs. I was a little bit afraid of them getting broken off while I was working. I make sure they're nice and smooth by using rubbing alcohol. Okay, now I can work on the neck. I start by just making sure the foil is covered. Then I can blend it together with rubbing alcohol. I love this little cuticle tool. It's great for blending it all together. So this stage looks pretty bad, but I promise it will get better. I add a big piece for this neck muscle. I also build up the throat. I do add a little bit of wrinkles since her head is tucked in. I will have to touch up this side, but I'll do that once this other side is done so I can make sure it's even. Once that side hardened, I went around just filling in everything and touching up the neck. Next up is probably my favorite part to sculpt, the tail. I know this looks crazy, but here's my armature. I epoxied the wire coming off of the main piece so it would be stronger, and then some thinner wire for more strands. I pat it out with more hot glue and tape. I start from the tips and add my noodles of epoxy. I place a bunch down and start to blend them together. Not too much though, because I still want some of the lines to show. Once they are blended enough, I draw in more lines with various tools. I use Silicone for big separations, and the Cuticle tool and Xacto knife for smaller hairing. You can see as I go, different parts have hardened. I definitely didn't do this all in one sitting. It took a few sessions since it was so big. It's pretty much the same process for the mane. I did decide she would look very noble and regal with a Roman nose. So I put a big old glob of epoxy on her face and blended it in with my Silicone tool. I also decided I hadn't sculpted enough hair, so I added some fancy unicorn feathers to her fetlocks. I have to add wire support so they will be strong enough to flow in the wind majestically. I also added a hole for the horn while I was playing around with the drill. With the wires glued in, I wrap some thin wire around them so the epoxy won't just slide off. Now I can sculpt those the same way as the mane and tail, just a lot smaller. You can't see it, but for the horn I cut off a piece of an old lampshade and filed the end into a point with a knife sharpener. I don't think they would let me take this model on a plane. I decided I wanted some dramatic vines coming off, so I added more wire. I hot glued them into place temporarily so I could sculpt over them. I did end up deciding the middle piece was a tad too dramatic and took it off. I also sculpted some leaves on the vines, not only for aesthetics, but to help the wires stick to the horse better. And with those finishing touches complete, it's time to bring her to life. I primed her off camera with a white primer since I will be doing a dapple gray. Oh, just look how strong that tail is. Yeah, I probably shouldn't be holding her like that. I'll be doing some of the solid black areas with the airbrush just because it's quicker, but you can absolutely use pastels instead. Here I must have been tired or something because I messed up the tail. It's supposed to go black to white, not white to black, but I fixed it later off camera when I realized. Once that was all dry, I sealed it with a matte spray and I can start dappling with pastels. If you want to see this process more in depth, I have another video all about dapple grays. But basically, I cut the top off of this little brush so I can apply pastels in very small shapes. I'm also making sure to look at a lot of pictures of real dapple horses. I just flipped the images in Photoshop for the other side. shade in the face with an eyebrow brush. I'm touching her with my hand here only because I've already sealed this part with more matte spray. I also add some details in the black with my white colored pencil that I blend in with a blending stump. I used the same technique to add more detailed herring in the mane and tail. Of course, I have to paint the vines green. I water down the acrylic so I don't get brush strokes. I'll need a few layers to build up coverage. With that dry, I use a very watery dark green as a wash to bring out the shadow detail. I dab off any extra with a tissue. Then I can add highlights with a light green. For the eyes, I start in the center and fill them until just enough white is showing. I also add a brown ring and then some lighter highlights to the bottom. And then a little dot for eye shine. For the hooves, I add the white stripe to the tops and blend it down. Then I dry brush over it with black. Once all dry, I gloss them with Liquitex gloss varnish, so they won't be as likely to rub off when I put her on the base. In the long run, they probably still will, but this gives them a fighting chance. I add a little bit of tan pastel to the ends of the mane and tail. I also add a little bit in the black to give it some dimension. Off camera, I sealed her with some Testors spray lacquer for a satin finish. I couldn't decide on a horn color for a while, but I ended up deciding on silver, a classic unicorn color. I'm using Testors enamel. So let's go back and see how that base is looking. Actually, I worked on it at the same time, but to make it make more sense, I'm putting it all together here. I 3D printed this cool looking dragon skull with resin. It's actually from Skyrim, which is probably my favorite game of all time. Let me know if I should make Shadow Mirror in the future. So next I just pop that on with some epoxy. I fill in more areas with the epoxy and texture it with crumpled foil. I drill in more wires so the base will extend a little bit. It actually stands perfectly fine now, but this will be more for aesthetics. I fill in a bulk of it with foil and glue to save on epoxy. Alright, now for the moment of truth. Will this still support the horse if I cut out the middle piece? This thing did not want to come out. Okay, it moved down ever so slightly, but it's still sturdy. I will take it. I patted with extra epoxy just to be sure. I removed this bottom part, and now it's time for paint. I primed it off camera, and now I just directly apply the acrylic. I spread it around evenly with a wet brush. I wipe off some of it so that the gray still comes through a little. Next, I lightly dry brush with tan. I brush gray onto all the rocks, which I'm just now realizing I didn't film me making, but I do have an old base making video that has that in it if you're interested. Now I can dry brush them with white. I do the skull in a white base. I go over it all with tan with a mix of wet and dry brush. To make it look really old and weathered, I add water and a dark wash. I make sure to seal all that with matte, and now I can add some grass. I got a cheap brush and dyed it with yellow and green leather dye I had. You could probably also use paint. I cut off a small chunk and apply it with a healthy amount of super glue. It will dry enough to let go of within minutes, but not fully until a few hours. I add glue to the base as well for a strong bond. I added a little bit more later, but for now we're all done. Time for the final result. I'm so pleased with how she came out. I think it's quite the transformation. I hope you learned something from this video. If you did, make sure to boop that like button. And as always, thank you for watching, and make sure to subscribe for more projects.